recording to the cloud? Excellent. Okay. As I said, our speaker for tonight is Dr. Rachael Gabriel. She is from the University of Connecticut. She is the professor of literacy education at the, is that pronounced NEAG? NEAG?
Yeah, good for you.
NEAG School of Education at the University of Connecticut. She is author of more than 50 refereed articles and author or editor of 7 books for literacy teachers, leaders, and education researchers. Rachael currently teaches courses for educators and doctoral students pursuing specialization in literacy and is the editor-in-chief of The Reading Teacher. A former teacher and reading specialist, Rachael's research is focused on literacy instruction, leadership, and intervention, as well as policies related to teacher development and evaluation. Her current projects include investigating how educators and school leaders build collective capacity, state literacy policies, and discipline-specific literacy instruction. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Gabriel.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. I'm really glad to get to talk to some folks about this topic. So thank you so much to the organizers for this invitation. And thank everybody for joining us today on a Thursday evening, in maybe a very cold Thursday evening, depending on where you are. I don't think anybody's hot in the US at the moment, but anyway, nice to see you this winter Thursday. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So what I'd love for you to do is play the music in your head that you play when people are like doing all the clicking around that they have to do to share their screen. So whatever that song is, hit play. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. And here we go. So there's a lot of talk about adolescent literacy. Again, we tend to think about pendulum swings in discussions about elementary literacy, kind of going back and forth between different philosophies. But I think the pendulum swing with adolescent literacy is from a whole lot of attention to not much attention, and then a whole lot of attention to not much attention. And with that comes some challenges with sustaining efforts in this area. And so I'm really excited to be able to be in community with folks that think about this a lot and that are interested in thinking about it more. One of the questions that I think people are asking right now about adolescent literacy is what is foundational to it? Actually, I think that's a question they should be asking. There's a lot of books, podcasts, blogs, opinion pieces coming out at the moment about foundational literacy for adolescents. And I think there are some assumptions about what is foundational to adolescent literacy that need to be questioned. And so disciplinary literacy is part of that questioning. It's part of the widening of what counts as literacy for adolescents and what counts as foundational to their success with literacy. So I want to begin with the idea that whatever counts as foundational to a young person's literacy has shifted and is still shifting. It's always in flux. It's always emerging. There isn't like a set thing that all teenagers must know in order to get going. And that their pathways to it, I think, are divergent and can go in directions we haven't seen yet. So literacy in middle and high school has to be built, not assumed. And usually we can see examples of it, examples of features and skills and practices and habits of mind and ways of doing things that complement and support academic literacies across different content areas. And we see them outside of school and we see them in leisure reading practices. So often evident outside of the formats and genres that we test and outside of the formats and genres that we assume kids can do. And then also that what's foundational to an adolescent's literacy at the moment may not transfer to sort of traditional ways of presenting and assessing knowledge. So I had this interesting experience with a group of juniors who'd just been accepted to our School of Education. They're going to be teachers, but it's their first class in their school, in the School of Education. It's their first semester in the School of Ed. And I said to introduce a word as part of a little activity. And every single one of them pulled up a PowerPoint slide. And I was kind of surprised because I didn't think that introducing a word required a PowerPoint slide, but they couldn't imagine doing anything in the classroom without the PowerPoint slide behind them. And so I talked with them about this for a while, and it might be isolated to this group of 18 kids. It might be isolated to those 18 kids who were juniors this past fall, which means that they were 4 years ago In 2020, they were juniors in high school. But a lot of their idea of what counts as instruction is put some stuff up on the slide, and the kids can read or copy it. So that was our starting point, obviously not our ending point. That was our starting point, and it made me think about how students are used to engaging with text in a classroom context and how they engage with text outside of classroom contexts, and whether the bridges between those things and the distance between those things has gotten wider recently. And if that's true, then all of the conversation right now, particularly about NAEP scores that were just released, and thinking about how they don't look the way people want them to look for 8th and 10th graders, if that's true, that there is an increasing distance between the ways that kids use their literacy and the ways that their literacy is tested, or how it's assumed to have developed, then it could be that NAEP is actually measuring a version of literacy that is similar to, next to, close to, but not exactly the kind of literacies that our pandemic survivors have developed over time. And so I think there are lots of folks that would say from their own experience or from their observation that school is not, if you think about an individual and whether school is really designed for that individual person, if you're somebody who thinks that school was really designed for you, or maybe kind of fell a little bit outside of the mold. If school is designed for a certain version of adolescent learner, that maybe never was a great fit for individuals, maybe just sort of average or groups, or my friend Norm, who I've never met, but everybody keeps talking about him, so I guess he exists somewhere. If school was always designed for a version of like an adolescent named Norm, that norm has shifted. And that creates a distance between the foundations that students have developed as readers and writers, the way that they interpret and use text in their lives, a distance between that and the way that they're asked to read, write, and talk about text in class. So a lot of what I've been thinking about with disciplinary literacy is using the disciplines to widen our understanding of how text is used and how we should be using it, so that we can build all kinds of different literacies at once, instead of ignoring one in order to build another, or assuming that we've got to shut one down in order to build another. Boop. No, don't boop again. There we go. Okay, so I have a book out called Doing Disciplinary Literacy, and the goal of disciplinary literacy is to invite students into the practices that make them full participators in the activities and tasks that make up the discipline that you're teaching. And there's a lot of difficulty, as Elizabeth Moji's written about, with this idea of discipline, because disciplines are much too big a category to explain anything about how text is used. The early work on disciplinary literacy came from college reading and writing centers, where folks were trying to assist people with the reading and writing they had to do in their increasingly specialized fields. And we understand fields on college campuses usually as kind of academic disciplines like math and science. STEM as a discipline, way too big though, because the differences in the text that kids are reading and writing follow the particular community that's doing that thing. They don't follow the building that community is working in. So for example, on our campus, we have actually 2 engineering buildings, but the way that civil and environmental engineers construct and use and share text is pretty different than the way that mechanical engineers construct and use and share text, and they're on 2 different floors of the same building that is called the discipline of engineering. And honestly, when we get down to it, we find that there are differences in the ways that text are constructed and used and shared and critiqued, room by room. So one lab and another lab in the same area are actually creating ways to organize information and share it and create texts that like embed certain assumptions and use certain content and certain vocabulary. And that varies lab by lab. So it doesn't follow the discipline, it follows the community. And we know this because you know that you sort of develop your own kind of discourse within any group of people that you are used to. You have kind of catchphrases that you throw around. You have callbacks to things that were said before that are now assumed background knowledge. You've got specific vocabulary that you use, a specific way of orienting to a conversation and greeting people that is different than the way that you might greet people down the hall or at your house or in the coffee shop or wherever else you find yourself doing your thing. So the goal of disciplinary literacy instruction isn't to make somebody read like a scientist, because that doesn't mean anything. It's to invite students into a wide range of different ways of reading and writing so that they can develop awareness and flexibility, so that they can walk into any community and become aware quickly, orient themselves to the way text is being used, and that they can participate in that use because they are aware and flexible. Some folks might call that meta-discursive awareness, your awareness of discourse and how it works. It's related to meta-linguistic awareness, but bigger than that. And doing it really requires three things. So are you ready for the three things? Here's the three things. Here's your punch list, 1, 2, 3. If we want to do this kind of instruction, then within whatever content area we think we're teaching, we have to look for the literate practices that accompany those texts. We've got to investigate the processes that make those, that underlie use of those texts in these different areas. And we have to develop that awareness and flexibility to understand and use them in different ways. I want to unpack these a little bit with the next couple of slides, but also quickly now, in case people are thinking about them as they are in their list of 3 right now. One of the things that is that surprised me when I did one of the first studies that I did of disciplinary literacy in a high school setting is I asked, we pulled random schedules and just asked kids to tell us, depending on their different schedule, what text did they see that day? What were they asked to read and what were they asked to write across the day? One of the things that surprised me, I guess it shouldn't have, but it did, is that everybody read current events in every single class. Now, they're all reading newspaper articles, and because we're here in Connecticut, they were reading the New York Times or the Hartford Courant. And so they had New York Times and Hartford Courant articles kind of all day long, or Newsella. But they were using those articles for different purposes. So when they pulled out a newspaper article in math class, they weren't reading it, top to bottom, left to right, every single word, and highlighting the details, the details so that they could find the main idea. They were looking for the stats so that they could represent the stats in a different format so they could sort of do that literate practice in mathematics of translation. Mathematicians are always translating things. And so in math class, they were using that text in a particular way to do a particular thing, even though it was the same text or same kind of text that they might have seen in social studies, where they might have looked for a different set of things and decided a different set of things were important than in English class, where they might have used also a newspaper article, but used it in different ways. So we need to know what texts go along with different disciplines, go along with different communities that do things in the world. And we need to understand how they're using that text. Because often we think that a text is, too challenging for the students because they wouldn't be able to read it left to right, top to bottom, every single word for word. Something like the Constitution is a heavy lift for everybody. That's not a reason to take it away from students and say, primary source is too hard, because the way that historians actually use that text, or that lawyers use that text, or that reporters use that text is actually quite different. We read the Constitution in really small snippets over and over again. We don't read it line by line, page 1 to page 110, highlighting main ideas and details and putting sticky notes. So the tools we have for analysis when we're trying to figure out, okay, what are the texts that go along with my discipline that are different from a current events article and a textbook? What texts show up when we're doing the work of the discipline? And how are people using them? What are they doing with them? And can I invite students to do those kinds of things with this text, even if the text is unfamiliar, challenging, super dense? And our tools are basically to think about what's the purpose, what's the audience, what's the format, and thinking about these 3 things as interconnected, that the purpose is driven by the audience, and also changes how things are presented because we assume certain things about the audience and we present it in a way that works for them. And this is workable for literally any text you can come up with, because we don't produce text as human beings. AI will, but as human beings, we don't produce text for no reason. There's always a reason. It's because somebody needs to know something. We don't write to rabbits. Some people maybe write to their pets, but in general, we don't write to inanimate objects. We usually write to somebody, or we record and present information to somebody. And so the format that it ends up in, the way it's organized, where the important stuff is, where the not so important stuff is, where the entry points are, is really a record of our thinking about what do I need to express and who am I expressing it to. So you can kind of pretend that you're a little bit of an archaeologist, trying to figure out, what society made this text and what must their purposes have been and what must their values have been and what must have been interesting and important to them based on the way that it comes out. We can kind of work backward. We can reverse engineer things. So what I'd love for you to do just at the moment, today, right now, if you want to, you can be one of those people who like pretends to do the audience participation, like not, but say you did. But anyway, here's the audience participation for the moment. Just open up your phone and count how many tabs are open. If you'd prefer to do it on your laptop, like open up your browser and count how many tabs are open. And then jot which apps on your phone are open or tend to be, if you've done that thing where you like close them all real fast so that people don't see. But like what apps tend to be running in the background kind of all the time? If you're doing it on your computer, think about the tabs that you tend to have open kind of all the time. And think about what different texts show up there and what it might say about the things that you are currently actively thinking about and doing, the kinds of text that you engage with. And think about, especially if you're looking on a phone or looking on a larger screen, how is that text organized for you and for that purpose? I'm going to give you a moment to do that. You can also kind of keep doing it in the background if you need to, or just sort of do it in your head if you prefer. I do like eventually at the end of the day to kind of close all of the apps that I have open on my phone so that when my children inevitably figure out my passcode, they don't open up something that they don't need to look at. Like the news, but anyway. And yet, when I think about what tends to be open all day long on my phone, I drive around a lot to different locations, so I always have Google Maps going. I do check the news all the time, and I like to check a few different sources, so there's like 3 news apps open at all times. I feel like I need to check in with email often, so my email apps usually are open. That's kind of a normal thing. I never know where I'm going, and I'm never on time, so my calendar app is always open, and I always keep rechecking it because I remember things wrong. I'm like, I have a haircut at 2 p.m., except it was at 3, but whatever, I didn't remember that. So anyway, those things are always open, and they tell a little bit of a story about my day, but those texts are actually pretty different from each other. And the way that you interact with them in a successful way is also pretty different. The way that you interact with Google Maps, which is a text, is really pretty different than a calendar app, which is really pretty different than news articles, which is really pretty different than email. And so there are a lot of different texts that I move flexibly between and across. And there's a few things we have to think about when we're thinking about how do we develop that flexibility and that sort of strength and flexibility that you need to be a successful reader and writer across different domains. The first thing that I think about whenever I think about like, stop for a second, look at all your tabs, is that everything worth doing in the world at the moment is always already multimodal, multitextual, multidisciplinary. I once worked with a scholar from University of South Florida whose face I can picture, but his name I don't remember, who said that everything worth doing is always already interdisciplinary because nobody just sciences without also doing a little bit of thinking a little bit about the historical context of what they do and maybe doing some math and sometimes writing it out longhand like you might have in English class, like these disciplinary boundaries that make up a schedule in middle school and high school often don't actually follow the activity or the task. And so when we ask kids to artificially do one text at a time in one mode and for one discipline, we might be asking them sort of to tie a hand and a foot behind their back because they actually have the skill, they have the practice, they have the habit of using many texts at once that are multimodal. There's pictures, there's like movement, like there's video or GIFs, whatever. There's data displays, and there's text, short form, long form, and everything in between. They're used to that kind of multimodal, multitextual, multidisciplinary thinking, reading, and writing. And in school, we often ask for assignments that don't require that and also don't let them use that. So students might have this range of literacy proficiencies that don't actually match up with what we want them to do. And if we want kids to be able to be successful with what we're asking them to do in class, we need to make the connection first between the ways that they've already developed literacies, and second, to the way that this kind of a text would actually need to be used. This is one of the first things that I read about. It's not about disciplinary literacy, but it sort of is the foundation of how I think about these things. And I like the idea, I have it in here as a screenshot, because I like the idea that this was written around the time that phones looked like that. And this 1, 2, 3 that Donna has written out for us really haven't changed at all. I think they actually work as a pretty nice starting point for a lot of the conversations. But what has changed is the literacy that kids bring into this equation. Now, it's sort of quaint at the moment to think about how she was writing about adolescents of the net generation, because I don't think we call them that anymore. And I actually don't know if anybody really called them that, like in a widespread way, but the net generation, I'm pretty sure, was, like the 90s. And now we're in a really different generation. And so the way that kids are using literacy actually lends itself beautifully to disciplinary literacy instruction and discipline-specific literacy instruction because it's specific, because it requires flexibility to move across different text types and purposes for reading and different modalities. We just have to meet that wave a little bit better. If you look for research on what we know about teaching literacy to adolescents, there's like a couple of federally funded practice guides, and this is one of the summary pages of them. And what is useful, I think, about this is that it's super broad, and what is challenging, I think, about this is that it's super broad. So like, but what do we do? And how is this different than what we thought we were supposed to do for both younger students and older students? I don't think it is. So if we need to be more specific, if we've got to think a little bit of a smaller grain size, there are some ways of thinking about updating these. And I think disciplinary literacy ends up offering us the layer that is sort of missing. Dan Reynolds, a couple of years ago, just really a couple, like 2 or 3 years ago, did an update trying to really add to what we know about adolescent literacy. And these are the topics that really show up for him as super important in the literature over the last 12 years. So looking back to the 2008 practice guide. The other thing that he found is that the 2008 practice guide had these sort of skews, things that they weren't thinking about and groups that they weren't tapping into because they were reviewing existing research at the time, and the research they had to review was skewed this way. And so Dan concludes that really the difference that we need to be thinking about that make strategies for adolescents more powerful and that are focused on advancing the literacy of people who've made it past the primary stage is we have to think more about the digital literacies that they bring and the digital literacies that they need to develop. We've got to think more about the discipline-specific literacies, and we have to do a lot more with writing. So if we want to do disciplinary literacy, I have 3 big important questions, 1, 2, 3. These are kind of outlined in the book that I published recently. So if you want like the thinking and activities that go with them, they're there. But I want to just talk through them briefly with you so that we have some time to discuss and see what you're thinking. So big important question number 1 is not what, but who is the discipline? Who is the community of people that do the thing? Disciplines are supposed to be, like, at the basic definition of them, is they're communities of people who develop, share, and critique knowledge. But as we know, we don't do that as humongous populations. We do that in actual, like, physical embodied community. We do that with the people that we are reading, writing, and talking with in a very local way. And we develop idiosyncratic things, ways of using language, ways of organizing text that match that community and its purposes and its activities. We know this because we can find differences in the way that mathematicians read, from history to math to chemistry. That came out like 13 years ago. And then there was even more. What is 2025 minus 2017? 8 years ago, they looked just at engineers and found some differences between different labs of engineers. And my colleagues here, a couple years later, also found that within mathematics, there's a set of different text types and purposes depending on the nature of the mathematics that you're doing. So identifying the community of practice means figuring out who uses this text to do something. And usually we have to ask that question outside of school, because there's always a way of answering the question that is, we use this text to assess knowledge so that you can pass the X test, so that you can take the next test, so that you can go to the next grade, so that you can go to college, so that you can blah, blah, blah. There are academic reasons for things that aren't particularly compelling because they don't shape the way the text is created. They're not part of why that text is that way and how to read it effectively. So we need to figure out who uses this text today, right now, outside of a school building, and how are they using it. And part of the way that you can think about this is think about, like, the different kinds of text that somebody might see across their schedule, across their day. If they go to play rehearsal, what texts are surrounding them? If they go to hockey practice, what texts are surrounding them? If they're in a business class, if they're in a history class, what might they be seeing and how might they be using it? And we might think about how in all of these different activities that kids might be engaged with throughout the day, or that they might choose to engage with in their leisure time or as a profession, or as a becoming profession, that text might be really central to the work, or it might be adjacent, or what we call facilitative. So in English, the text is the point. In English class, we're talking about literature, and so the text is central to what we're doing. It's really easy to identify the text that goes along with the task. I would say that that's probably true of play rehearsal also, that the text is central to what you're doing in the beginning. And then it becomes adjacent. You're supposed to literally be off book. You put the text down because the text is in your mind, and the text you're actually paying attention to is the embodied text of the spacing on the stage. You stare at the script until you can stop staring at the script because you've memorized that text. And then you're working on blocking. You're trying to figure out how people get around and where somebody should be and how you relate to the props and the stuff that's on the stage. So the text is actually the people. In the same way that in football, you might have the playbook that you actually read, and that might be central to your team meeting. Like, everybody's got their playbook out and they're looking at it, but the playbook isn't even in your hands when you're playing. So it just becomes facilitative. It's like way on the sideline. What's central at the moment in the moment of a game is the text you see unfolding on the field, the meaning that is represented by the location and the speed and the formation and the patterns that you're seeing out there. You have some adjacent text while you're playing too. You've got the scoreboard. You might have people holding up signs. You've got, other things that you might be paying attention to. Adjacent, like they're there for the activity and they maybe help, but they're not what you're actually doing, which is playing the game. We can think about this also like in science class. You might be deep in the textbook for a few minutes at the beginning to get some information and some vocabulary, but then you wander away from the textbook and over to your lab bench to start doing some stuff. And then that text might have been facilitative. It's not in front of you anymore. What is in front of you is the lab setup, and that's what's central. So understanding the symbols, the organization, and the meanings and how you've set things up and how different reactions are happening, that's your central text at the moment. And we act on and create and critique and use those texts all in pretty much the same way. So when we think about the text that we put in front of kids, we're looking for texts that can be authentic, but that term is like a nothing, it's like a throwaway term because everybody's got a different definition of that. And I think what makes something authentic to a discipline or authentic to a content area or authentic to a community is you see it in use. So we have to ask, what are people doing with this text? Is it central? Is it kind of on the side and they don't need to read it all the way through? They just need to have it as a reference? Is it actually like sort of back in the background, like it facilitates it? It would be helpful if you had read these directions, but you probably could figure it out on your own. So we need to think about like who's doing what when this text exists or when this task exists. When this task exists, say that 5 times fast. What texts are surrounding it? What are all of the texts that surround it? Because you do it with one at a time. And how are they being used? We want to think about it as reverse engineering, like where have you seen this text before? What was it for? Who made it? How is it used? When do you write? When? Like, what are these things? Imagining that these texts that we put in front of kids are brand new to us for a minute and like, whoa, what is it? Why is it the way it is? What does it tell us about the people and the processes and the purposes for reading and writing that made this text exist in this way? If we're stuck in a textbook all the time, we probably end up with similar answers over and over again. And textbooks do usually have some kind of a role when people are actually using this knowledge to do something in the world, but they're usually adjacent. They're usually like as a reference to refer to. So they're not as much of a kind of record of how this information and how this knowledge is deployed for real. They usually are collections, which is nice for reference. That means that kids also have to have some kind of experience interacting with the other texts that surround their tasks. So, big important question number 2 is, what is that community using the text to do? In order to answer this question, we have to start with rule number 1, which is that everything is a text. And if you are ever confused that you think something is not a text, what you need to do is reread rule number 1. Anybody who's been to Connecticut and gone to the Stu Leonard's knows exactly what I'm talking about. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, read rule number 1. Text is any representation of meaning. We use the same cognitive resources to make meaning out of different visual representations, no matter what kind of visual representation we're talking about, so we can develop literacy skills while we're playing ice hockey, while we're cooking a pancake, while we're playing pizzicato, or while we're reading a book, as long as we're making the connections between these ways of doing meaning making. So you can flip it, pluck it, slap it, play it, drip it, whatever. All of these are texts that people can pay attention to. I really like thinking about, partly because I have music ed majors in my classes, but I really like thinking about Gustavo Dudamel in general, but a conductor as creating a text that is temporally bound. The text goes away in a lot of the same way that a movie does or a film does. He is signaling a set of things in a particular context that mean a certain set of things, and people need to be able to interpret them, notice and interpret them, be aware that you should be noticing and interpreting them. But it's not static on the page, like you can go back to it. It's moving. I remember working on a musical when I was teaching middle school, and there was a band. Our band was being the band for the musical, and one of the kids asked me why the band director was waving that magic wand around, and I was like, "That's such a good name for a baton." He's drawing pictures in the air. So if everything counts as a text, then we can be a little bit more flexible in how we think about doing the reading of that text. I once was in a workshop with folks. It was supposed to be a workshop about reading strategies. And it began with a couple of high school reading specialists saying, I told the social studies teacher that they shouldn't be using that textbook because it's much too hard for their kids. And I was like, tell me more about that. And they said, well, I mean, the Constitution is in that textbook. And right in the first 5 sentences, I'm already like past my 5-finger rule of 95% accuracy, or the kids won't understand it. And I was a little stuck because I didn't want to undo that thinking that like people should be reading things they can read and want to read. And I didn't want to undo the thinking that like we need to make sure that the texts we use are accessible. Except Nobody starts at the top of the Constitution and reads the thing all the way through in order to answer 5 comprehension questions about it. Nobody outside of school reads the Constitution while somebody's timing them to see their words correct per minute. Like the way that we're doing reading and writing in school settings and the way that we're measuring reading and writing in school settings is often pretty far removed to the way that those texts are actually used when you're doing an interesting activity in social studies class, or even more, when you're using the Constitution outside in the world. Because she's absolutely right that the US Constitution is not written at a 9th grade level, but that doesn't mean that 9th graders can't interact with it. Do you know what I'm saying? When we think about reading all different kinds of texts and making meaning across different kinds of texts all at the same time, always being multimodal, always having multiple texts out, always using a few different things in order to make meaning, there's basically 4 things we need as readers. So there's basically 4 things we need to make sure that we're equipping kids with when we introduce a new kind of text or a new purpose for reading an old kind of text. We need to know where to begin. We need to know what to decode or translate. We need to know what's important and what is not important. And then we need to know how to move across a text. So I was in the unfortunate position a couple of years ago of trying to find very rapidly a bunch of clinical trials for a friend with stage 4 melanoma. And so I went to the search engine where you find all the clinical trials, and I started searching all this stuff, and I got super confused and super frustrated, and I super didn't know what to do. Now, nothing about this is actually too hard for me. If I cut and pasted all of these words and put them in a Word document and threw them through, sure, that works, a Lexile analyzer, it wouldn't come up as that difficult. Some of the words are probably longer than others, longer than typical, so it might come up as like high school level. But a lot of them are not super unfamiliar, and the patterning of them is really not unfamiliar because the longest words are just sort of Latin prefixes and suffixes added together. So this shouldn't be hard for me to read, but it is really hard for me to read. The context of it made it difficult, but also just my background knowledge, my understanding of how these things are organized. I don't know what NCT is. Why do you have an NCT number? National Clinical Trial. I now know, but I didn't know. And I was confused about how to make my way all through this stuff. So I called somebody who uses this text all the time. I called a friend who works in, I don't know, pharmaceutical somethinging. And I said, like, so help me understand a couple of these words. And he said, actually, if you know these prefixes, suffixes, or bases, you can figure out exactly what all of these things are. And you are definitely looking for either a kinase inhibitor or you're looking for an immunomodulator. So if you just look for things that have these little chunks, you don't need to know all the rest. So he gave me something to decode and he gave me something to prioritize. He also helped me sort of make better inferences about what to pay a lot of attention to and what to pay less attention to by explaining the phases to me. And I was like, oh, great. Now I don't have 900 options. I actually have like 40 options, and I can take my time and sound things out and weed my way through them. And then he also told me that there is a way of looking at the important information first so that you don't have to read the whole thing. This is really similar to the way that people teach you to read research articles at first. Like you can find the overview, the summary, and the abstract. You know that they're all organized in exactly the same way. So if you want to skip the discussion of the methods, you totally can. If you actually need the methods, you can go right to it. You don't need to read 25 pages of a 25-page article. I don't need to scroll forever and ever and ever to give myself carpal tunnel. I can just go to the place that I need because I already know if he doesn't meet the participation criteria, I'm not reading the study. So I have to have this idea of where do I start? What do I decode? Like what elements of this are unfamiliar to me? I've never seen the word. I've never seen the symbol. Tell me what it is. I need to know what's most important for my attention, and then I need to know how to move. I think if you think of the text of a commercial kitchen, same thing. I need to know what I'm cooking here. Where do I begin? Am I beginning with the little pot, the big pot, the one in the back, the one in the front? Or did you just want me to clean this thing? Like, where do I begin? Decoding, like, I want to know what the light one and the dark one is because I'm not sure. And then prioritize. I need to know which ones I'm responsible for, what needs to be ready first, what's what. And then how I need to move. Where is this going next? What do I need to bring over here and where is it going next? And then I can come and I can start to kind of participate in the doing of the activity that is represented by this text. And this is pretty much true of any text that you could think of. It's true of the text of a remote control. It's true of the text of your GPS. It's true of any text that you can imagine. You have to know where to put your eyes first. This is really similar to how we teach reading in the beginning, right? We've got to figure out where to put our eyes and how to move them. We need to know if there are unfamiliar symbols or if there are unfamiliar representations of ideas. We need to know what some of those are. And we also need to know what to ignore. I have it written down as prioritize because that sounds more like positive and active, but really it's like, what can you skip? So I can skip 4 of these pots because my job is to make sure that the filmy one doesn't explode. It will, and it'll get all over me, but that's it. And then how am I moving? How am I moving from there? So the big important question, number 3, is related to this idea that we have to know where to begin. We have to know what to decode. We've got to know what to prioritize and then how to move on from there. Those are what we need to teach if we're teaching a discipline-specific literacy. Big important question number 3 is, how do I invite kids to do this kind of stuff with me? I've found the texts that actually represent the activity in the real world, not just in a classroom. I have organized those texts. I've like given them the text and I've sort of oriented them to the text. Like, here's where you start. Here's what a few of these things mean. Here's what you can pay most attention to. And now I just have to think about, like, how is the text usually used? So how do I get you to do what people usually do when they're using a text like this? The English teachers that I work with pre-service are often troubled by why their students should be reading classics, and particularly Beowulf and Shakespeare are the examples that I get a lot. Why do we need to read Beowulf? And I don't have a great answer to that. Like, I'm not sure that you do. But if you are reading Beowulf, what you need to do as an instructor, if this is something you have to do, is think who outside of school uses this text or something like it, and what are they doing? Well, like, filmmakers use it. And so, like, how would a filmmaker use it? What would they be thinking about as they read? What would they be doing? What other texts would be out on their desk when they have Beowulf out? Probably, like, when it's being put up as a show, like scenery, people read it, but they probably don't read the whole thing. And they probably read really trying to visualize all the time. And they probably read with lots of like different kind of scraps and ideas of what it might look like, and basically a Pinterest board of the images that go along with Beowulf, and maybe some history books to like give them ideas about those images. Maybe they're setting it in a different time period, and so they have books about those things out on their desk. But I think about, like, where does this text exist out in the world? What other texts are surrounding it? And then what are people actually doing with it? Are we reading it the way that I've assigned it to be read, pages 1 through 33 tonight for homework? Like, what would it actually look like if somebody was using this text to do something? Because outside of a school setting, nobody reads for no reason. Nobody writes for no reason. We're always creating or using text to do something. So we have to simulate that activity so that we are prioritizing the right things, and that actually makes it much more accessible. We also have to think about this idea that, like, kids, everybody, not just kids, everybody has ways of using language that they bring to us when they come as pre-K kids, when they come as freshmen in high school, when they come as freshmen in college, when they show up their first day on a job. They have these ways of using language, and we have to notice and extend them. It's the same idea as emergent literacy, just all grown up. All disciplinary literacy is still emerging because it's still changing. The science labs, it's not even worth, when I first started teaching content area literacy, people were like, can we just have like an encyclopedia of like, here's how a scientist reads, here's how a mathematician reads, here's how this other thing, like, no. Partly because it changes. In the time it would take you to publish it, it would already have changed, and it would have to be the biggest book in the world because it would be like every single science lab has its own subchapter. So people bring their ways of languaging, and we've got to notice and extend them. I see how you're using your text messages too. And this is similar to, or opposite of, or related to, or completely unrelated to this other way I want you to be using language. I want you to just be introduced to it. I want you to participate in it for a little while. When I think about like the language that kids bring to a classroom and the ways of using text that they bring to a classroom and the kind of ways that we want them to be using it for whatever test or whatever project or activity that we have planned, I don't really think there's a sort of this one's better, this one's worse. The question is like, how far away is it from what they want to be able to do? So if your way of using text is pretty far away from the way that a sound engineer uses text, then we want to work on making the connections that you need to close that gap or to bridge the gap and close it. But if your way of using language is actually already pretty close to the way that an actor would read this play, then let's talk about how we can bridge your ways of using language toward this. This is where I get stuck when people are talking about the NAEP scores and pulling their hair out, because I don't think anybody actually cares about the way of reading and writing that's represented by the NAEP. Read this passage, answer this question. I'm so sorry that your literate practices are a little bit distanced from that at the moment, because I don't know, you live in a world and do things. I'm kind of cool with it. Oh, that was the end. That's cool. In summary, I think that's the end. It thinks it's the end, or it's just frozen. No, it totally is. That's the end, guys. 32 total slides. In summary, we got the three things. We have to wonder a few things, and we have to do a few things. And what I'm hoping for with disciplinary literacy is not that kids learn 7 new ways to read, but that they just get really flexible at figuring out how to do it across different settings for different purposes. Here we go with the stop share. Now I saw your beautiful faces. Hello. Tell me what you're thinking.
I would say at this point, if anybody has questions for Dr. Gabriel, we'd love to have you ask them. You can come off of mute or you can drop them in the chat, whichever one's better for you. You've stunned them into silence.
That's what they all say.
Hi, I am Heather Weymouth. We've met and chatted
What's up,
before,
Heather?
but tonight I have a whole big slew of my graduate students with me who are studying to become literacy masters, literacy specialists. So they're all practicing teachers and now learning the next level, part of which is coaching. So what advice can you give for folks who are trying to learn how to coach disciplinary literacy when they're not disciplinary insiders themselves?
I got 2 things to say about that, Heather, and thank you for asking. So one thing is, often our content area teachers aren't disciplinary experts either. We call them that, but really what that means is they majored in something in college and they haven't had a lot of experience necessarily actually doing the discipline. So the place that I usually like to look in any middle or high school is related arts, because those people are most likely to be actual users of the literacies. Like if they're a music teacher, they're likely to make music on the outside. History teachers don't always go home and do history. Some of them do. Some of them are history buffs, or they're curators, or they do things that actually match up with the discipline of history or some part of it. English teachers might go home and do some leisure reading, but they're not necessarily doing like literary criticism, or maybe they're not putting on a play. Like they're not poets themselves. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But often we're working with people who know the content, but not its context, not the actual practices that go along with it. So what you're coaching them into is an exploration of, if you want kids to do this activity or use this text, where does this text exist in the world and how is it used? And how can you copy some of those things, borrow some of those things to make your use of it more accessible and more authentic? Because authentic is accessible, but also if you're using it in this more authentic way, it becomes easier. And then kids get the practice and they get kind of stuck on a cycle of success instead of a cycle of failure. The other thing to think about with coaching people in disciplinary literacy practices is it's usually people usually want their kids to be able to read and write better. What they mean by that, or when people come and say, my kids can't, blah, 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 or when people come and say the texts are too hard, so I simplified them, I rewrote them, or I printed off an easier one, or I told them, I got rid of the text completely and I told them all the information that they need to know. Usually people want students to be more developed in their literacy than they are. And so that's an in for you as a coach to be part of the conversation. And the challenge is, I sometimes feel like when I'm coaching content area teachers, I'm just asking them to be better at what they do. I'm not teaching them anything about reading. Because if they're better at what they do, then they are providing the context of like, what is this text, who uses it, and how do we use it? And that has very little to do with the kinds of things that I learned in my reading specialist certification program. Like that has very little to do with words correct per minute. It's very little to do with like all of the different strategies for learning vocabulary words. I have a lot of reading stuff that I can give you, but really what you need to do is make your lesson organized around an activity that's worth doing and that actually would be done outside of a classroom setting. You need to make sure that your work is mirroring the way that people actually use this knowledge to do stuff in the world. And sometimes when it's too hard, it's because it's the wrong text, not because it's a hard text, but because this isn't the text that goes along with what you're doing. An example of this might be I'm sort of outside coaching. A band teacher has given up on doing any reading because the kids don't do the reading, so we just play. And I asked him, what reading were you having them do? And he was having them read Wikipedia articles on the composers. You know who reads Wikipedia articles on the composers in order to play their music? Exactly nobody. But like, that doesn't mean that text isn't part of what we do in band. And even sometimes that like written out, like literal print text isn't part of what we do in band. My question is, what text do people who play music end up usually reading? Liner notes is one of them. People are like obsessed with CDs still. I don't understand this, but anyway, the liner notes that come with things, the album notes. They read interviews with musicians. They read subtitles that go along with videos. They read program notes because the program notes give you kind of the extra. And then they read all of these texts that are not continuous text. They read all these different forms of musical notation. They read schedules. They read seating charts. They read bus timetables, all of these other texts that surround what they do. So I have to think about that sort of like central, adjacent, facilitative. What are the other texts that surround these activities that I can engage kids with so that they are continuously practicing reading stuff that actually matters for the kind of work that we're doing, instead of asking them to stop what we're doing to go read this thing that doesn't matter because it's good for your reading. It's sort of like saying, stop eating food so you can come over here and like suck on a supplement tab. That doesn't make any sense. We want you to be doing as much science as you can because science can't be without text. But reading your science textbook can totally be without science. You know what I'm saying? So I think the two things with coaching are we have to help them be better at what they already want to do. And also kind of if they have been around for a little while and they were around for the years when we used to all have to like hold hands and sing that all teachers are teachers of literacy, which meant at a certain time in our history, that meant that people should stop teaching what they're teaching to teach strategies instead. Wah, wah. And people have bad taste in their mouth about being told that they've got to like reserve 20 minutes for independent reading when you don't even have time to cover what you need to cover. So we're not there to coach them into doing reading instead. We're there to help them find the texts that are already embedded in the best work they're doing and help them think about how to make that text accessible so they can keep doing what they're doing. So usually being a disciplinary literacy, like that orientation to coaching has been way easier for me than trying to be a reading specialist in a high school. Like nobody we don't want it. They want their kids to be more full participants, so we can help them do that. We don't want to do the reading thing instead. What else is on your mind?
We have actually 1 minute left. So timing is perfect. So if anybody does have a really burning question that they would like to ask or to drop in the chat, that would be wonderful. In the meantime, I did put a link into the chat for a survey just to kind of give us a little bit of feedback on the presentation and the webinar. So if everybody wouldn't mind taking a minute in order to pull up that form, that would be awesome. Does anybody have any last minute questions for Dr. Gabriel? All right, thank you so much. We really appreciate your sharing your expertise. And like I said, if everybody could just go ahead and take a second in order to complete the form, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.